Yeah, I thought last week was great in just highlighting the greater the skill set of the community in dialogue, really the stronger the community. So I was really pleased that we covered some of that last week. Did anyone have any questions they wanted to pop in before we start, or we just wait for when Ramsey's ready? Are there any questions anyone has? You want to pop in before we get started, or?
Hey, Frank.
Yeah.
I'm having a bit of trouble placing where all these laws go. Is it possible to get like a family tree, a decision tree type thing?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So tonight is proposed to be the last of this series, which starts to introduce some of these concepts around what is the minimum viable laws and systems of law necessary for sovereign DAOs. We're going to start a series, re-kick a series again called The Law Explained within the next few weeks. And that's going to come about when positive law, and that's the source of where these first notes come from that I got Ramsey to post as part of this series. And when that's launched, and you can get it through Amazon, and we'll look at other ways to get access to it. That gives you the overview. So that's where you get the overview of what are the different families of laws, from sovereign law, positive law, natural law, cognitive law, and the different structures and how they fit in both older societies, modern societies, different structures, and of course, digital communities. Does that answer that for you?
Excellent. Appreciated.
Good. Well, Ramsey, how close are we to getting started? I think he's still looking to see other people coming on.
I'd give it 2 more minutes and then we'll kick off.
Okay, good. Are there any other questions or queries people have before we start? Far away if you've got anything on your mind from listening to the previous calls or something that comes up, we can tackle it before we start if you like. Doesn't matter if you don't.
Hello, Frank.
Hey.
Hey, what's going on, man? This is John Lovell. I don't know if you remember me, man. It's great to hear from you. I just wanted to pop in and say hi and see how's it going and everything.
Good. Yeah, good.
Man,
really
it's,
good.
Yeah, it's amazing just to touch base with you again, and just happy to be here.
Now, thank you. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to reconnecting and making the opportunity to do Q&A where people can ask whatever questions they want to ask a regular feature moving forward. There's just some housekeeping to do on some of these updated structures of law that's been worked on really for the last 7 or 8 years since we took a lot of the Ucadia stuff down. So great to hear your voice. Yeah. And
yeah.
And did you get to see the 2 posts of the introductory sections of the updated positive law? Did you see those connected to the previous audios? Or
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I read both of them, and I actually missed the call last week, so I guess I'm kind of behind the curve on that. But as far as the introductory provisions and the logic, rhetoric section, it's amazing. Just if I may, just expound a little bit on that, man. I read Astrum de Juris Canonum, backward, forward, up, down, sideways, and what you put together in the form of that consolidation just kind of unlocked like so much, and it just makes so much sense now, especially as concerns, I guess, the concept of reality versus unreality. So yeah, I just again, man, it's almost surreal to have come this far. And so just to say hi to the group. Again, my name's John. I've been at Ucadia for as far as I can remember, back in the year of protest. So I've been, studying diligently, and like I said, man, just have you, consolidate that. So now everything is just becoming so clear.
Well, thank you, and that's what it's about. Look, when people come to this fresh, and they come to this maybe with a few queries or concerns, it's extremely difficult to find a baseline, as you know. You kiss a lot of frogs, you go down a lot of rabbit holes, and and what I've looked at and realised is that if anything, the amount of noise and the amount of counter arguments now is never been greater. Like, we're literally living in a blizzard of noise. So
right.
if the introduction and the concepts are not crystal clear, if you don't see a baseline, if you can't see what is law and what isn't, if it's not self-referential, if it's not based on common sense, then it's very, very difficult for people, especially if they're coming from a professional side, to kind of get a handle on this. Because, some great questions last week. One of them was about credibility, and I absolutely resonate with the question. This concept of, well, what can I be confident about to start this journey? What can I sort of sink my teeth into and say, what I'm about to hear or what I'm about to spend time on is not going to be a waste of time. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of time was spent on that. Years, in fact, was spent on how do you consolidate thousands and thousands and thousands of pages and years and years and years into 50 pages. And that's what the introductory section is. You firsthand. You've done the journey.
Yeah, I see the progression in terms of the 22. Just a real quick interjection. I mean, the 22 books of law, the Astrum Juris Divini Canonum. When you start reading, it's almost like when we stopped. I guess we paused was fiduciary law. Yeah.
Yep.
So once you read, and like you said, you just absorb this stuff, you actually become the canons. Like, you finish canon. So it's almost like, whether it became almost preferential, yeah, I prefer to, have all 22 books available at hand. But the thing about it was that, like you said, once you get to a point and it starts to vibrate and you get the answer, it's almost like, you pray. The same thing as prayer. And you end up doing the right thing. And then, without even thinking about it, I mean, like you said, it becomes rote, almost secondhand. And so that's what I've been doing for, this time. And then to go back and to refer back to, the sacred texts or canons or, whatever talk shoes or blogs or whatever, and to see and to have that verification that, yeah, I did the right thing and I did it without even trying. It's an amazing feeling. So yeah, just if I may, just encourage people, this is the real deal. I mean, there is none other. So I hate to get so serious this early in the call, but yeah, just it's been amazing, an amazing journey.
Oh, well, I'm really pleased you're on, and I hope as we go tonight, because this will be the last of the series of introductions. So I hope later on the call, please chip in with your own experience. But I'm going to refer back to, thank you again, John. I'm going to refer back to Ramsey and get you to kick it off, and then I'll do a little brief overview of what we hope to achieve tonight, and then I'm absolutely into the Q&A of people as we go through. Ramsey, are you good to go?
Yeah, good to go. Thanks,
Okay.
John. Thanks, John, for making it here and finding a way here. That's awesome. This is the last of the mini series, if you will, on decoding law, and it's become the theme of how to achieve minimal viable sovereignty. We've done 5 of these sessions. So before Frank kicks off, if you scroll up to the Decoding Law channel, you can ask questions there, and I can, if you want to ask a voice question, I can feed you in, and let's kick it off.
Okay. No, thanks, Ramsey. So look, the theme tonight, Ramsey asked me what given there's a running at the moment a session on Polkadot Decoded, which has had its first sessions over the last few days, and heading into workshops in a few weeks' time about ongoing development within the broader Polkadot and parity community. And we're just talking about how do we round off this introductory series to try and squeeze out some more value, given that we'll be off the air for at least a few weeks until we start the Law Explained series and when we come back on. And the things that, having looked at some of these early sessions and the feedback, again, to this minimum viability, I thought there were some themes tonight that were, I think, really important to reinforce. And I hope, if it's possible, we can repeat what we were able to do last week. There was some awesome summaries that went on from last week that we're able to add into the chat. And I especially thank Richard for being able to do that. So I'm hoping tonight that we can cover some, I think, unfinished clarity on what is the minimum viable structures to establish sovereign DAOs. Now, we've covered in the last few weeks that a sovereign DAO needs to establish its own laws, its own bylaws. That's a given. I think everyone who approaches this or has thought about it or listened to it accepts and acknowledges that. What I try to explain with law, in understanding law and kind of demystifying law, was this idea a few sessions back that all law is moral. And by that, I didn't mean, and I certainly don't mean, religious. There is in Ucadia, because of the way Ucadia is structured, Ucadia being a total system, and that it's at this point more heavily weighted in its introduction from a spiritual and religious point of view, there is potentially the default for people to think, well, we're talking about religion when we talk about law being moral. We're not. What we're saying is that a community needs to agree on a common framework. And by doing that, when a community agrees on a common framework, that is, in essence, what we mean by morality. And that's an important distinction to understand the nexus in the community and how important it is that the community, in a true sense, collaborates and agrees to and agrees strongly to the core laws that they have. Again, over the weeks, we've spoken about numbers and examples, and in some of the material I've provided, it is extensive, and I make no apologies that complex structures like Ucadia that seek to provide a broad array of support necessarily has to deal with a great number of laws. But I have made this point, I think, throughout, that the number of laws, the number of rules that a community adopts does not need to be in the tens of thousands. And certainly when we look at living in the UK, Australia, the United States, and elsewhere in the world, we are talking about systems that have potentially millions of rules in this system, and which is a complete overkill. So when we talk about laws, we're not saying that a community has to adopt 500 laws or 400 laws. What a community, a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization adopts should be the minimum required number of rules to ensure that its structure functions both on-chain and off-chain, which is what we described last week about the essential organs that mirror the digital community. They should be the same. There shouldn't be one set of rules for the digital and a completely different set of rules for the off-chain. That would be a grave error. So whether that be 100 rules, whether it be 200 rules, it really is what the community establishes in its design as the minimum. And I would suggest and really consider that when starting out on this process, you should err on the side of brevity. You should err on the side of only rules that really firmly establish a necessary function, and not look to adopt a huge whack. The good thing about Ucadia is you can go through and you can see for yourself in structure those things that are necessary, and that gives you an opportunity to select, choose, discuss, debate. So you've got something to benchmark against. And then leading on from last week when we spoke about organs, another thing that we've done in the first 4 of these series is to try and understand that when we talk about concepts like decentralization and democracy, that we need to look at it from the reality that we're talking about human beings interacting with technology. We're not dealing with mathematical constructs. We're not dealing with artificial worlds. As much as we can get stuck in those things, and certainly with augmented reality and the work that's going on with Meta and all these other groups, it's easy to get distracted from that. When we talk about decentralization, I've tried to reinforce this, and I'm going to reinforce again tonight, that decentralization does not mean abandoning and creating artificial and unreal structures that simply have no example in nature. Rather, it's taking the best of what we can learn and acknowledge that true decentralization is when a system and systems are able to function autonomously, and that people are able to see their rights flow like blood flows through veins, like electricity flows through circuits, like water flows through rivers and creeks, and that we can actually see that the delivery of voting and polling and rights and expression coalesces through a community in an efficient manner, and not in necessarily a gaming or chaos or only the strong shall survive experiments that at the end will only leave a handful of people with a handful of influence, and in many cases will burn off a lot of people who get frustrated and leave. So tonight, as a capstone, I do want to focus on this understanding of the nature of organs in the context of systems, and what do we mean by systems. I want to focus very much on natural versus artificial when we talk about decentralization, and I want to talk also about understanding how, in practice, we can see examples of this being put into effect, and certainly from last week, and adopting specific structures that give us true autonomy and true decentralized, efficient, sustainable systems for our sovereign DAO or our meta DAO for our community. So Ramsey, that's a bit of an intro. Did you want to comment before we kick along?
Thank you, Frank. Comments? I think that's, yeah, that, please continue. I think it's a great topic to discuss, practical, and it's interesting, some of the things you mentioned off the bat, because it's very resonant to how these newly formed sort of nebulous DAOs are designed essentially in a sort of chaotic way, where things emerge, which is interesting, but at the same time, the chaos can be cause over tension, or perhaps over stress the system. Where if we had a different, more conscious design, it can perhaps allow for a more maybe not harmonious is not the best word, but something like that. So yes, it'll be great if we can continue with that.
Right.
From my opinion, thank you.
Well, look, I do want people to be able to chip in as we go, because I think this what makes this series work, and what I really love is the interaction. So let me qualify two things as a continuation of this, and then I would love to see people's feedback, whether you agree or disagree. By all means, if you disagree, please speak. Got questions, please. I want to make this, I think this is important, given, again, Polkadot Decoded, there's a release of new material, discussions, direction from the leadership of Parity and the Polkadot and Web3 Foundation. And I think I would like to make this so it's on the record. To challenge and to grow and to reconsider and change are strengths, not weaknesses. And so when leadership recognises something's not working, so for example, how long it's taken to get proposals through the current Web3 and Parity and Polkadot system, and want to reform that, that is an awesome and a positive sign of an integrity. Absolutely. It shows integrity, and it shows the kind of forward thinking that built this verse that people come to from this call from Edgeware, Kombucha, and the broader Polkadot community. So I want to commend that, and I want to say that is first and foremost an incredible strength. Last week I also said that at the end of the day, communities are only as strong as those people that wish to work and contribute in that community. A community can have the most perfect design, and this is coming from me, by the way, from Ucadia. You can have the most perfect design, but if no one's going to use it, you don't have a community. So again, in respect and acknowledgement, I think it's important to show that there is a real deep passion throughout the broader Polkadot Parity Web3 community to see change occur. So again, that needs to be recognised. What I'm talking about here is that how things in practice can quickly devolve from an ideal into a less than ideal framework when you veer too far away, or you start to experiment too broadly as you start to add layers on the technology. Whilst you're in the technology layers and you're dealing with specific requirements that are necessary to grow, features and functions and missing new crates within the substrate environment, these are all things that people focus. But once you start adding to that and you start talking about procedures, policies, strategy, it's easy to veer away, and suddenly you find that rather than empowering, you can essentially devolve back to an autocracy by inadvertently. And that's why I phrased what I said as I don't see as intentional. I see these potentially as risks. So I want to give an example of what I'm saying. If you look at nature, and indeed if you look at the Homo sapien body and the multiple systems that operate you as a physical being, we are awesome and awesomely complicated machines. And nature over millennia has spent enormous amounts of time and effort and experimentation to perfect the tension between control and autonomy, between, if you like, direction and instinct or sense or collective consensus. So a good example of that is our brain and our nervous system. Our nervous system is fundamental throughout our body to ensure the body functions. And as you all know, if the nervous system is in any way damaged, then organs and entire parts of our body cease to function, or indeed our body entirely ceases. Similarly, the nervous system relies upon the brain to provide some of that work, that processing, but also some of that direction. So there is a good example of a tension, but also a dynamic in a natural system between the concept of governance and the concept of decentralization. In nature, it's seen as a system rather than labeling one thing or another kind of like a competition or a game. The danger of governance in talking purely in terms of elements of a system is that you, in a sense, draw people away from viewing the whole to almost like a competition of parts. As last week we spoke, an off-chain community needs its organs, and an off-chain community, such as a trust company, a company that essentially is a body politic and corporate that mirrors the digital world, needs these things bedded down. But of course, in a digital world, we're open to experimenting. So in nature, governance and decentralization are in fact elements of a cohesive and autonomous system. They're not competing parts. So can I just stop there and get people's feedback, questions? I just don't want to do a whole monologue here. Ramsey or anyone, is this making sense to what I'm saying, people? The difference between talking at a system level rather than the parts of a system, we almost get into competition. Can I get some feedback as we go? Do people agree? People disagree? Does this make sense, what you're saying?
If anyone
Ramsey?
has a question, they can please unmute yourself. From my perspective, yeah, this is great. This is what we want to. This is what we're working on, and it's great to have your input there, Frank. And your mentorship, and as this is as what you've been working on with Ucadia, and from the testimonial from John there, all the texts that you've distilled from law and on that level, on a community level.
It's cool. All good. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ramsey. Hey, Richard, far away.
I guess the process of seeing everything as a system. How do you identify? So there's two ways of looking at it, and I'm just trying to sort of process this from the work that we are ongoing and doing. And this kind of comes down to, is it almost essential for us to move ahead of anything that can be turned into our bylaws? And when you talk about sort of thinking about it from a systems perspective, like everyone is contributing in lots of different ways. And as you know, we've had various ups and downs with the community, and the community has shifted its focus. It's shifted its members. It's shifted its kind of like values. In many ways, that feels like a very natural and organic process, despite it being insanely chaotic and difficult for all of us. But that feels in many ways like the natural order of things. And so the question is with the laws that you're talking about, the sort of few number of laws that you want to sort of implement as you go. There's clearly a kind of a wealth of knowledge that you're bringing from kind of what kind of laws we can bring in. But would it? I guess I'm just trying to work out which end do you start. Do you start with these are our direct problems right now? Regulating, say, let me pick one thing specifically.
Sure.
There is because we have this treasury made up of edge that people can put forward proposals to. We are sort of ad hoc kind of figuring out how to spend, and also what are the terms of the agreements, and also what are our kind of rate cards, like should we have rate cards, like should we be spending in certain ways. And anyway, so I guess like what my sort of slightly fluid question is asking, which side do you start? Is it almost an essential part of this process that we are making mistakes and then going, okay, let's take this tension, let's take this disagreement and use that as a starting point for a law or a standard? Or do you think that you start with laws? It's kind of like, which end do you start?
Okay. Well, I think where you need to start, and it's a good question. It's a great question. First and foremost, the reason I'm talking, it's not an abstract, it's a very practical level, talking about systems as opposed to governance versus decentralized elements, is before you start hammering out at the micro level, you need to be clear on the macro outcomes you wish to achieve. For example, the community at a minimum viable level needs to be clear in its mind before it does anything. What does it wish to be in the next 3 to 5 years? It needs to not only ask that question, but it needs to be able to answer that. So at least at some level, there is an elevator pitch. In screenplays, are called a log line. It's essentially a single sentence that could, as a snapshot, describe what edge would be, what kombucha would be, what parity would be in 5 years. Something meaningful that's not chock full of isms and acronyms and floating words, something practical in 3 to 5 years that the community at a minimum wishes to see it become. Now, is that a sovereign meta-DAO? Is it meta-DAO? Is it a sovereign DAO? What is it? And it's got to be clear first, because the risk of being organic and innovative is that you can, if you think about it, go back to nature, you can almost innovate yourself into extinction. You know what I'm saying? You miss the bigger picture. Is that a reasonable thing to say?
I would say yes, and I would say that we probably spent the total of a year's worth of man hours or people hours arguing, debating. The Edgeware website is a summary of how hard it's been to distill a 3 to 5 year vision, because, as I said, it's this
okay.
thing.
Well, then last week we spoke how to take that from a difficulty of dialogue into a functional dialogue platform. And I gave you a tool set last week that if more people are aware of the tools and are able to acquire those tools and agree to develop those tools, then that type of logjam should become less of an issue. But the question you said is, where do we start? And my answer to you is, you've got to start with knowing where you want to go. When the American founders started, they knew what they needed to achieve. It took them a long time to get there, but they knew what they wanted to achieve. You need, as a community, of your own accord, need to agree on that minimum vision of what you want to be. If you don't, then all these activities could ultimately continue to evolve. They could be amazing, they could be innovative, but you could almost innovate yourself into extinction by not looking at this bigger picture. knowing what you want to be is the very first fundamental. That's why we made the suggestions of Web3S rather than just Web3, that law and systems beyond just the technology layer, you already know this, but it needs to be embedded as part of the DNA, are essential. So if the quickest answer is that in 3 years you want to see Edgeware as a sovereign MetaDAO, great. Well, then you work backwards from that, and then all the steps you need to take become clearer. Does that answer the question, Richard? I mean, it's a macro question, macro answer, but does that give better clarity?
Yeah, it makes absolute sense. And I would say that the challenge that has the challenge with this whole process is that I my view of what Edgeware is has evolved quite a long way, but ultimately it's been refined bit by bit, not by any sort of not necessarily by the debating, but simply by the actions that we're taking as a community. It's almost like the community is realizing what it is by the things it is doing, and therefore, in some ways, there is a very obvious simplification of Edgeware's proposition, which is forming in front of our eyes, if that makes sense. And so, when I said the kind of like we've been debating this for a long time, I would say we have been debating this for a long time, but ultimately, what we are is now being very clearly defined by how we're behaving, because we are acting as a we are funding R&D, like we're funding like we are a decentralized or a decentralized organization funding research and development. We're Web3 Foundation, except we're not based in Switzerland. Like, and so I think for me that's the simplest possible proposition, because at the heart of it is, what are we doing more than anything? We're not like onboarding loads of apps or dApps or any of this stuff. Like, we are making grant funding proposals up to and around £25,000 or $30,000 to teams in exactly the manner the Web3 Foundation does, except we're doing it in a organic, grassroots and truly decentralized way. And ultimately, the main question throughout all of this has really been, like, what is the value capture proposition? So yes, we can keep on funding these $25,000 or pound grants in Edge, but ultimately there is a very simple question, which is, if we can keep on doing that, but what's the value accrual proposition for Edgeware for doing that?
And that's right, yeah. and that's why you need to be clear. So if Edgeware, so we talk about what a MetaDAO is, yeah, as essentially an incubator for other decentralized organizations, but also providing the kinds of systems and support that people are looking for in having both a recognized autonomy digitally and from the off-chain world in being a fully fledged body politic and corporate that has legal rights recognized externally, and its own courts and its own arbitration. If that is the goal, then the funding proposals then need to be focused on how to flesh that out and achieve that, as opposed to potentially, as you mentioned in your answer and comments there, being a kind of micro version of Web3 and doing potentially better than what Web3 has done until some of these roadblocks in funding are resolved. The danger, as I say, is Web3 and parity on the ecosystem should be dealing with the macro funding, and Edgeware runs a danger of funding things that ultimately should either be handled above them or part of the other ecosystem. So I think once you clear that is your objective, to say Edgeware is a MetaDAO, then the funding and how funding is granted and where the priorities lie in funding becomes much clearer. But until you have that, it's very difficult to comment and say, well, this is good or this is bad, because if you default to commercial realities, then, as I said, you could innovate Edgeware to becoming essentially a DAO VC, and the very nature of Edgeware, this is what I say about innovation into extinction, you end up being something completely different to what people might have wanted it to be. That's all I'm saying.
Well,
That's a great point there, and from both of you guys. And regarding funding things that should be funded perhaps by a higher level, I think we should be a bit more. I mean, now that we're talking about these things, because we're not talking about general things anymore. I think we should be careful not to, because that can be used against sort of development, getting certain development funded, because by its nature, we're funding what we're building is open source. So this is where these partnerships and collaborations with other funding bodies that are other stakeholders can come in. But I guess when we know what we are and we can define ourselves better, then it's much easier to interact with other entities. But if I may, and bring it back to the title and the description of this call, which might help in the discussion. Which, let me bring it up, is Decoding Law: How organs and organ systems can work in a sovereign DAO. And the description, to paraphrase what we spoke about yesterday in what we wanted this last episode to be, is comprehending and replicating nature to design decentralized social systems, and how to not fall into the trap of authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm.
So in that regard, like, how do we define authoritarianism in this instance? And secondly, I've experienced in how various quote unquote DAOs and these like online decentralized communities are functioning is a sort of, they can fall into the trap of like death by committee, or at least like decision making by committee, where like no one's willing to stick their neck out and sort of make a clear decision for themselves. Instead, they have to defer all the decision making to the general body for then everyone to vote upon, and that can sort of lead into needing permission to go to the toilet, to take a leak, basically. So how so is there when we talk about authoritarianism, is there a room
let's go through those?
Yeah.
Let's go through it. So authoritarianism, death by committee, and there's this old chestnut of critical thinking, and I guess the dangers of leading, but then leaving people behind. And I used this analogy to you, Ramsey, as a good example. If you take Parity and Polkadot, if you take this community, and let's be frank about programming. People who program and build wizards, one truly cannot be a wizard unless you are blessed by being touched with a bit of the spectrum. I use that phrase too, and I hope everyone understands what I mean by that, is that if you are able and capable of spending the hours you have to do to code, then there's a certain personality traits and certain sensitivities that a master programmer has compared to other environments, let's say stockbrokers or real estate agents, etc., etc. Certainly you can engage, but it's a different dynamic. And the danger is that if you open things up to being too chaotic and too gaming, some of your best minds, your most talented people, are going to be burnt and lost in the process. And that is a real danger in not recognizing these things. So I come back to a key thing that I still believe is not firmly established within the parity, Web3, Polkadot, Edgeware and Kombucha verse. Well, Kombucha, yes, but in other parts of the verse. And that is to end this cycle of talking about governance versus decentralization. Can we end the debate and simply say that a system comprises of its parts different elements? In themselves, they are neither good nor bad, evil nor beneficial. How they are applied will ultimately determine whether they are effective, and if misapplied, the consequences can be authoritarian systems that essentially hollow out some of your most talented people, and all that's left is a core group of alpha people, and that's the end of a community, ultimately. It may be a sustainable business, it may be a very profitable business, and it may employ lots of people, but that's the end of a vision of a community. So I think I really hope that in this series and reading these notes, we can rise above what is, frankly, a introductory level of dialogue that keeps putting decentralization versus governance as some kind of battle between good versus evil. It's not. Systems are what runs communities. Systems is what runs nature. Systems is what runs your body. And the only way that Edgeware or any DAO is going to become sovereign and survive is to embrace and define and function systems. Now, a system is, in essence, the identification, usually of at least one organ, one functioning organ. Often there'll be more than one. What do I mean by an organ? It might be a legislature. It might be membership. It might be leadership. It might be technology. It might be audit. It might be funding. But there'll be some organ that defines a structure of authority deemed by the community, a set of rules that connect that and identify that, whether it be off-chain and on-chain, or it should be usually both. It should be some connection between both sides. A system is then a definition of the rights that are connected to the authority. So where there's authority, there are rights. What are those rights? Rights means if someone holds a position temporarily, permanently, belonging to that organ, what can they do? What can't they do? Rights. Now, if there are rights, there are then obligations. So if I'm given a right, what am I also implied that I need to do? There needs to be that dynamic of the things that I'm supposed to do. And then finally, a system defines how that functions over time and space and place. Is it a replicatable thing? Can the organ, in a sense, be forked? Can roles be forked? Does it devolve? How does it essentially develop its own autonomy? So all those questions and all those elements constitute, in a fundamental way, a layering of a system, whether it be technology, whether it be law, whether it be members, whether it be finance, whether it be oversight, whether it be support and training and education. They're all legitimate layers of a system of a community. So the first thing I think is still not clear is there's still this running debate, which is still at the very starting line of this discussion, where people are still positioning governance versus decentralization. And I feel making errors of judgment by not viewing the whole thing as a system. Once you view it as a system, then you have this incredible opportunity as a community and communities that take this knowledge and apply it to look at different ways to approach things. Liquid democracy. Do we need to elect people for 3 years? Can they be there temporarily? Do we have delegates? You can start to think creatively. But if you approach it purely from this base binary view of centralization or governance is bad, decentralization is good, and ignore that these in a community is not one monolithic system, it's layering of systems, then this is not going to even get started off the blocks. Authoritarianism, I don't believe at any stretch within Parity, Web3, Polkadot, or any of these communities is an intention. But it certainly is potentially an outcome if this kind of debate continues and this lack of awareness of system design and recognizing that a community is more than one system. And we spoke about this, Rams, the other day, yeah? We spoke about that a community is more than one system, yes?
Yes. And perhaps to develop the governance versus decentralization a bit further, I mean, it's a bit more nuanced than that, in that each of these substrate chains, and Edgeware being one of the first examples of these substrate chains, excuse me, they have what, a core feature of them is, give me a second, sorry.
Right. Actually, while Ramsey's just doing that, can I do one example? Can I just give one example here? Okay. So I want to give an example of sometimes this is not the fault of the community or any leader in the community. It's actually part of the wash from the current system. And I want to use a really good example. So we're talking about intelligence, we're talking about knowledge, we're talking about community. So a good word to use is members could be described as neurons, yeah? Members of a neuron of a collective intelligence. I'm not saying that that's how I view it, but I'm saying we could use that analogy. So neuron is a Greek word, and when we hear the word neuron, we almost entirely think of the governance of the brain. Is that what you, by default, Ramsey, would hear? If I said the word neuron, you'd think of brain?
Yes, sure.
Okay, cool. All right. And so neuron as a Greek word means nerve, yeah? All right, that's what it means. So there's another word that we hear in the body, and it's the word nerve, which I just mentioned, yeah? So when you hear the word nerve, you think of, your limbs, your arms, banging something hurt. We think of the nervous system of the body. And the word nerve is a Latin word, yeah? So if I said the word nerve, you would tend to think of the decentralized model of the body, wouldn't you, by default? A nerve is the decentralized, yeah? Is that a fair analogy, Ramsey?
A nerve being the
part of the body, the decentralized body, yeah? The nerve is the body, the decentralized parts of the body, yeah?
Okay.
All the nerves in the body, yeah? So the neuron, by default, seems exclusively governance, yeah? And the nerve, by default, seems exclusively the body as decentralized. So is that a good example? And I have a kicker in a moment to explain why I'm saying this, but is that a reasonable example of nature's governance versus decentralized debate we're talking about? Yeah, mind and body.
Mm-hmm.
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 Well, what do you think? You know what the word nerve means in Latin? It means neuron. You know what the word neuron means in Greek?
Nerve.
Nerve. Do you know when they look at under the microscope and see these designs of these actual types of cells? They're the same. And the only reason that we spin around in these endless debates is because some group of smart people decided to separate the mind from the body intentionally. And as a consequence, the communities have inherited that bias and are proceeding in their development with the same inherent bias, that there is a difference between the body and the mind, and that the body and the mind is a debate. And the solution is to get rid of the mind and just stick with the decentralized body. Yeah? They're the same. Literally, the words mean the same. So there is an example of two words applied to living bodies and living brains. And I'm hoping that people see that we can get above the semantics of language and start thinking in terms of system and no longer being imprisoned by accepting this divide and conquer mindset and essentially corrupting the potential of what you're part of. Think at system level. Governance is not an inherently bad model. Decentralization is not an inherently good model. There are benefits to both. When you design at a system level, you can optimize depending on what the system is. Is it your technology system? Is it your financial system? Is it your legal system? And that should determine the balance, not some philosophical or fanatical belief. Anyway, I'll defer back to you, Ramsey. Do you want to comment what you were saying before?
Thanks for that. My comment was a simple one, just that within the Polkadot substrate, Edgeware, Kabocha, Kusama ecosystem, and many other chains, there is a sort of default setting which is on-chain governance, which is a general concept, meaning that one can stake their tokens to vote on proposals, and there's various instances of that, and it can be designed in different ways. So we do have a sort of concept of decentralized governance. So they're not necessarily there's not necessarily a clear argument that they're in total opposite of one another. But from what you've been saying there also, and just to comment on what you said there, sorry, Frank, is that
Sure.
Is what you're talking about is systems within within a community or whatever scale society, and so this is not just about necessarily DAOs, but we're in a space or a sandbox where we are able to experiment as online communities who are like willing participants and enthusiastic about forming these new systems, and a large subset of people are interested in taking these digital communities and making them relevant, not just in the digital realm, but also in a physical realm, as we've been exploring over these past few sessions.
Yep.
And yeah, so like what we're talking about here in terms of and what you're highlighting in terms of organs and organ systems and neurons is something where at the end of the day, whether we use the blockchain technology or the internet, we are a group, we are humans, we are sort of each of us are sort of cells interacting as and organizing in a certain way. And so the question is, how can we organize better than what we currently have available, or what we currently see?
Well, then let's look at that and say, is a community, and I'd love to open this up to others to comment on. Can you see more than one system in Edgeware, or are you still viewing it as a monolithic system? Can you see more than one system? And if you do see more than one system, could you see, and if you accept that a system doesn't inherently state governance at one end or decentralization at the other end as good or bad, but finds the general weighting depending upon the needs of the system? Good example, if you want to be a sovereign autonomous organization, you better have an ability to manage your own legal matters. And that means arbitration. Yeah. So arbitration necessarily places a greater weighting on governance, courts, some arbitration system, clearly. Yeah. So your judicial system or your legal system is almost certainly going to have if you were looking at a line, and at one side of the line is governance, or central, the other end is decentral, then for your system called law or courts, it's going to be probably more geared towards the central and governance level. So let's open back to you guys. Do you see Edgeware, for example, as being more than one system, or has that not necessarily been your thinking of this? Can people give us some thoughts on this, even if it's not questions? Let's get some feedback from people to see what people think. Yeah,
please. If people can go into the Decoding Law channel and just share some of your thoughts, ideas, questions, opinions. It'd be great to stimulate some engagement there. And I guess when you, Frank, like with system, how do we define system? I looked into organ, what defines an organ, and that there are 78 or 79 organs in the body, which are a sort of tissues that are let me bring up the definition. But if we look in the Edgeware channel, there are various channels within it. Some of them being events, public square, traders, builders.
Yeah. Are they systems?
Proposals. Maybe not systems, maybe they're organs.
Or their activities, or their groupings.
They're groupings, essentially. Yeah, forums, just categories, I would say. Probably not consciously organs. Yeah,
so some may be markets, some might be categories, some might be categories of dialogue. But this is good. This is what you're starting to see. You're seeing things with fresh eyes, yeah? Because the problem with the community is activity can mask. You can look at that and go, gee, we're a good community, we're ploughing along, we've got thousands of dialogues occurring. But is there real depth to that? And the danger of that is that will web and wane. People will be active for a period, they'll go off, they'll get tired. Yeah, systems have a deeper purpose, and we need to understand what we mean by that. And I'm just about to give you a definition what I use. So I define a system as a type of model, so a type of construct, being a set of objects or concepts that have their own set of rules. So it has its own set of rules, properties, relations, and behaviours. So essentially, it's something that can be defined at some level as having some semi-autonomy. There you go. Systems is a way of nailing that mercurial thing that we all like to talk about, autonomy, but within a community. Is there a layering of rules and relationships and properties that could come together and be defined to a certain degree of autonomy? That's what I mean by system. So with that in mind, what do people think when you look at Edgeware? Can you name more than one system? And if you can't, why don't we just look at a current off-chain society? Can you think of more than one system of the society you're living in?
We definitely. I would say, Frank, that one of the hardest things to do has been very early on. The creation of the website, the Edgeware website, was an exact example of getting stuck in seeing the mechanism or mechanisms and not seeing the whole and the systems that ultimately establish what is Edgeware. And I think where it sort of rooted into was there was a debate relatively recently about changing the name of Edgeware to Edgeware DAO. And my pushback was, which bit, point me at the bit that is the DAO. Like, because the DAO is many different things. As you're saying, it's the systems. Is the DAO the system of creating the funding? Is it the system that decides how the funding is granted? Is it the way that we vote in people to give them certain influence? Is it all the stuff we're sort of starting to get on now, which is the rights that are assigned to the various people, the expectations? So I think in a sort of rush to establish, and I would say most of this is because people are struggling to frame Edgeware in relation to other things. Therefore, you look at a smart contract platform, you go, oh, Edgeware is a smart contract platform. But then someone else might point out that, oh, hang on, no, Edgeware is a treasury-funded project that's granting people proposals. And so you end up with this sort of endless debate about which part of the system do people prefer, and there's never this holistic sort of understanding that the whole thing actually forms Edgeware.
Okay, well, let's go through some of that because I really enjoyed the fact you were able to write some notes last week and do that, and I really want other people to chip in, but let's start the process. So, is Edgeware is the goal of Edgeware ultimately, in your opinion, to become a sovereign autonomous organisation? Yes? No?
I can give you the exact proposition that I think. This is not agreed by everyone, but this is the way I propose it and discuss it outside of Edgeware. So Edgeware is funding applied research and development of sovereign network publics. That's what it is. That's what it does.
Right.
And
well, then it's not a sovereign autonomous organisation if it's doing that. It's not.
Yeah. Well, it is moving towards that point, though. But it's not currently.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah.
No, that's cool. No, that's cool. That's cool. So let me rephrase the question again. Really simple answer. It's going to be either a yes or a no question. Is the trajectory of Edgeware towards a DAO, a DAO with sovereign autonomous identity, and certainly in the off-chain as being a private society? Is that the ideal goal in the next few years?
Yes.
Great, excellent. Okay, so if it is that, then Edgeware is in one sense, an aggregation of different systems. It's not just one. It's not a monolithic system. That means it has a technology layer that can be described, albeit its cornerstone, as an autonomous or semi-autonomous system, right? It's websites, it's crates, it's substrate, it's tokens. You can call all of that the technology systems of Edgeware, right? That's one set of systems. Yes? And we're not describing how they interrelate. That's not our purpose here. It's just be able to view Edgeware as a composite of systems. Another layer of systems would be members, and that is how people onboard, what it means to be a member, what are the rights of members, what are the obligations of members. Is that another legitimate system potentially for Edgeware?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, all right. And if we spoke about funding proposals and all the things that go with that, we're really talking about a financial system. So could we call it the Edgeware financial systems as another layer? I know that there's a technology, but just hear me out. There's still rules and procedures and all the things you're talking about. Is that another system layer potentially? Financial systems, right? Okay. So we're up to 3 systems. Now, there is a governance system, in particular with the obligations on the off-chain as a private society. Well, before we even get there, is there a legal systems, given we're talking about courts and arbitration, and for Edgeware to have any autonomy from a sovereign position, it needs to essentially handle its membership matters. It has to. So it has to have a way of resolving that. So it has to have its own arbitration system, doesn't it? So there's got to be a judicial system or a legal system as another layer. Is that reasonable?
Yep.
Okay. So how many layers up to now? Technology, 1. Membership, 2. Financial, 3. Judicial or legal, 4. And we haven't even got to and governance, 5. So at a minimum, we're talking 5, aren't we? At a minimum, yeah?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Has that ever been expressed in the terms of Edgeware?
Indirectly, I'd say quite a lot of stuff that I've written about has tried to separate out the different components. Probably the one that we haven't really talked about in much detail, or has never really been mentioned until you came on the scene, was the arbitration or the judiciary.
Okay. So if we take each of those, let's take the technology layer. At the technology layer, with sufficient planning and insight and development, should that layer run pretty close to autonomy? Like it has a high degree of autonomy? Would that be a reasonable thing to say? Do you feel? The technology layer? Okay, cool. So if we took a really simple idea of a piece of string, there's a center marker, one end is called central or governance, and the other end is called decent or decentralized autonomy. When it comes to the technology layer, the pendulum is way across to the decentralized spectrum, isn't it? Because we've just said that the technology layer of Edgeware is designed inherently to be largely autonomous. It still needs work and it still needs planning, but let's not lose sight. So on that system, we now are able to maturely discuss the diversity of this question of governance and decentralization and see that, at least on the technology layer, it's heavily towards autonomy. Yes?
Can I just, Frank, you've got 5 layers there. So technology, I'm trying to note this as you go. So it's technology, systems, membership, financial, legal, governance systems. How does that, I guess the question for me is, how does, because again, all these systems intertwine. So,
Yes, they do.
because I wrote down legal systems is agreements arbitration, but then is
No, it's
arbitration
not. No, it's more. No, you've got to be careful. Got to be very careful not to diminish the system. I'll come back to what I meant by system. Okay. If you want to stop with describing the system and not then try to eat them out until there's a more kind of robust discussion of what that system is. But a system, in its form that we're describing, is essentially a construct. It's a model that can describe a set of objects, concepts, organs, rules, properties, and behaviours that, as a whole, has a degree of autonomy compared to other aspects of a community. In other words, you can separate technology to a degree as an autonomous layer to other things. That is why it becomes a system. You follow? What it does and what's in it needs more work when we talk about membership, when we talk about financial, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So if we talk about governance,
we're
not just talking about governance of the entire system, but governance of each of those components.
Bingo. The light bulb moment. Now you've got and decentralized of each system. You see? You see how the monolithic debate has inhibited your ability to maturely develop and flesh out these systems, which is inherently what is the minimum viable structure you need to be a sovereign DAO, right? Let's get some more paint, right? Go.
That makes absolute sense. One of these things that as you were talking as well through that is that, and again, maybe this is like a feeling that we're on the right track and that we should be positive about the progress we've made. That these things are all emerging organically through. There have been a lot of arguments and debates and back and forth, and on one hand, people could say we've moved very slowly. There's been this sort of but it's also for me, my expectation has been set. I wouldn't say very low, but my expectation has been that the community will move slowly because these things are happening in an organic fashion rather than being autocratic. Is that fair? Like that things are.
I'm going to give you a mixed answer, yes and no. So, I'll give you an example. War, they say, is 95% boredom and 5% sheer terror. Yeah, and in other words, the pace that you move at is not necessarily a reflection of how effective you are. And you might be saying, "Look, we're moving at the pace that people want." But I come back to frameworks. If a good portion of the talented members you have are blessed with spectrum, because that's the nature of them, they're programmers, I can tell you that it's not a particularly pleasant thing to be in the argy-bargy of arbitrage, whereas people that may have a natural alpha personality, and Richard, you have a natural, you're a doer, you're a leader, right? That there will be some people that are intimidated by you, and that doesn't mean you're an intimidating guy or you're here to tell people what to do. But if you don't, if you're not looking at this at a macro level, then I come back to one of my first comments on the call tonight. You could be innovating yourself to extinction. You could be hollowing out the community where people, after a period of time, say, yeah, the decisions get made and I don't get part of it and I don't get to voice my opinion. I don't like getting into arguments people have. I'm a programmer, I'm a wizard, I make this, I make that, whatever it is. You've got to be conscious of this. And now with systems, we come to another system. So I ask you the question about finance. So the financial system of finance to be done properly requires some pretty significant oversight, doesn't it? To done properly? Would you agree?
Absolutely. I'd say that's the main contention at the moment.
Okay, so we answered at the technology level that the balance on the spectrum within the technology system, the arrow is pointed almost entirely down to decentralized autonomy, isn't it? But when it comes to finance, would you say the pendulum needs to be more towards governance and oversight for it to work properly, legally?
Absolutely.
Right. So now what you see is the debate at a monolithic level where this hasn't been fleshed out has inhibited a mature debate where, fit for purpose, the financial layer has a different profile than the technology layer. It doesn't mean that it's inherently evil, bad, backward, old school. It just means that for that layer to function as it should, the balance between those forces is different. It has a different profile. You can't genericize everything to one size fits all. One size doesn't fit all in nature. Never has, never will. That's an absurdity that is people are imposing in social constructs. It's an insanity, in fact. So I have no doubt that with these clarifications, the community can find its way and people can find their voices. And I hope with the notes that they will. And this is what this 5 sessions was about, to raise these ideas to you, but in an organic way. Love the word organic, but in an organic way to get feedback. Can I ask, is there anyone else that wants to comment on what you're hearing so we get some other voices on this? Questions or observations? And then by all means, let's keep it going. But does anyone want to chip in? Any comments on what you're hearing? Is it making sense to people? Hello?
Hello?
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, mate. I'm Frank.
Hi.
My question is around sovereignty.
Yep.
I understand how things like arbitration and kind of work contracts and that kind of thing can kind of help Edgeware function as a system, but I see all those things like in many kind of what you call, I guess, traditional companies and industries. What is it that kind of is able to separate us out, to kind of use one of your analogies, that aren't we just building a tree house in someone else's backyard? How do we get out of the backyard?
Okay, good question. So let me use some current examples. So, communities like the Jewish community have established their own rules and their own courts so that they are able to and are recognised as being able to handle a number of civil matters themselves. Yes? And even fraternities such as doctors and indeed lawyers are recognised as having sufficient internal structures and authority to arbitrate and handle matters between their members themselves, and that those matters are given legal recognition by the courts of societies. So this demonstrates that this is not new, that other people have done this, and really it's the degree to which you are able to self-manage within what is considered the essential elements of reasonable law and reasonable structures, which is what we've been discussing in the documents I've provided. So does that give the first part of that answer to you as an example? There are existing examples, and we should view that as the first steps. Look, it gets you to a private society, but the very nature of a private society is that you are able to handle certain things yourself. That is a degree of sovereignty, control of your own destiny, in part. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do, totally. I guess my only point on that is these kind of societies, they've still been granted these use of these laws by the system, right? So maybe they don't view them as a threat as they kind of would do the way of crypto. And I guess it all ties back into tax. Wherever we are, we can fall under a jurisdiction. So as long as we're under that kind of control, can we ever really truly be sovereign?
Well, okay. So take the FCA, for example, in the UK is a good example. So the FCA are developing a reputation as being trigger happy and all over you in like answer to picnic on a hot summer's day if you do something wrong. Let's look at the laws that govern the FCA. And what you find in the laws that govern FCA is that if you're providing services to members, your members, and that you have a mature set of laws, bylaws, and a proper structure off-chain, then the FCA is only really focusing on those entities that are seeking to sell or provide services for business and commercially. You see the difference? You see what I'm saying?
Sorry, my mic's not working too well, but yeah.
So again, if we take back to these existing examples of communities, there are loans that people in the Jewish community can provide to one another that are, and those services that have no jurisdiction. The FCA has no jurisdiction in that matter because it's private. It's members, not public. It's private. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the problem is, and what we're trying to do is you've got to be something. You can't just kind of be an amorphous mass. You've got to be clear. You can't play in the middle of the road. You need to make a decision. And there's nothing inherently bad about cryptocurrencies except when they're marketed in the way they're marketed. And the FCA steps in and says, well, A, you're out there selling this to the public, yeah? So it's not private, it's public. And so we're stepping in and saying there are certain rules. Now, whether you agree to those rules or not, they've established rules that say, we are here to protect consumers to some degree from what we feel is unsound selling practices. Now, whether they do a good job at it or not, once you have a private society and you have members that are aware of what they're doing, have acknowledged what they're doing, then all of a sudden some of these questions cease to be an issue, right?
Is this also, Frank, down to the, or maybe rephrasing what you just said there, you talk about private societies, that the FCA's role is mandated to protect consumers within a defined perimeter or framework or domain of a public, as in the British public.
That's exactly
Whereas-
what they're exactly.
Whereas if we say a private society, really what we're just saying is the FCA's job is to carry on and protect the public as defined by this particular framework. But then we over here have this quote unquote network public, which we are now defining via its own bylaws. And we are saying that contained within this, this is the expanse of the public and what that entails. And therefore, as long as there is an understanding, there is a way to interface between those two
Always.
things.
Always a way to interface. Always. And it's really important to understand. Look, again, I'm not here to cast aspersions on the FCA or the HMRC or the IRS or any of these organisations. They perform a function. If you live in those societies, they have every right to demand the nature of tax. We'll talk about tax another day, but as Ramsey knows, Ucadia defines all these things and is clear on that. There's no reason for your community to be in controversy to their world. There's no reason to. There's no benefit. In fact, but more importantly, there's no benefit in you positioning yourself in controversy. Keep in mind that includes words and language, and positions, and what you say and what you do. But as you become mature in your structure, funnily enough, you would probably find that there are a lot of people that in their system that want to work with you and are overjoyed by that prospect because that's exactly what they want to see, something that's sustainable. Yeah.
Yes. Frank, I'd like to go back to what Jamie described, which was the system, quote unquote, the underlying system, and then a sort of self-governing system on top of it. Is that an accurate description, or should we see it in a different way or understand it in a different way?
Yeah, preferably not on top. It's okay. I use the analogy, and I used this analogy to the other day. One of my favourite films, because of many layers, but one is The Devil's Advocate with Al Pacino. Yep. And in that, Al Pacino, in his inevitable style, is playing the devil, right? So Lucifer. So there he is in New York, top flight lawyer, John Milton, as in Paradise Lost. So they use the name John Milton. But the point is that he doesn't go around in satin pajamas like the head of former passed away head of Playboy. He doesn't walk around in red pajamas. He doesn't wear horns. He's not making a fuss. And the thing is that you see people, and certainly one of the byproducts of cryptocurrency before the latest bin fires, one looking at it objectively would have to say that there was an inordinate number of people kind of thumbing their nose saying, we'll do what we want and this is who we are and look at us, in a kind of arrogance to the system. There's nothing sustainable about approaching people in an arrogant way. It doesn't lend itself to cooperation, and it certainly doesn't ingratiate towards long life relationships. Societies that have been around now for hundreds of years exist across the length and breadth of major industrialized countries. And I would suggest that it bears some thought as to how they survive. Now, some of them are on the edge or have already passed the point of extinction, and that they're just existing in name only because they lost their way. But you can't deny the fact that some of these organisations have had an incredibly long life, like the Masons, for example, and it's worth inquiring as to what did they do in establishing themselves that showed a treaty, a cooperation, not an acquiescence. I'm not saying you have to acquiesce and agree to everything, but a bridge, a way of coexisting that gave them life. And this is what sovereignty is about. Sovereignty is about cooperation. When countries think that they can go in there and do whatever they want, that is the basis of the turmoil that we're existing in. You know, one country, China, for example, is doing that to great damage for their long-term well-being, and to the order in Asia and parts of the world. We have the example in Europe with Russia. Terrible things are happening. But at one level, it's a country just pretty much saying, we'll do what we want. So they are, on one level, a good example of what not to do, as opposed to working within reasonable constraints, knowing what you want to be, finding that common ground, and building. So yes.
And in regard to if that's okay, so if that's the case, there's these interfacing systems rather than one system on top of the other. And of course, it's all to do with language and how it's defined. If we define it as on top of that system, then that implies
well, it does. It does, and it's unnecessary. Look,
so how do we prove? So how can we? So what did the Jewish community do as a minimum viable implementation, or minimum viable society or private member society to enable them to have their own self-governance, self-policing society, and what are the limits? Like at what point can the outside system or the interfacing system of the another jurisdiction, perhaps the law of England and Wales, or perhaps a more relevant system, at what point can they encroach themselves into that other society, and how does that work?
Well, we come back to what we've been discussing. So once you recognise that your community needs to be a composite of systems, and that at a minimum we identified 5 layers of systems for Edgeware, didn't we? Yeah. And we recognised that there needs to be off-chain structures that we spoke of last week that incorporate articles of association, and then bylaws, being the statutes that are the dynamic policies. Then we can frame a checklist and work through these in a fairly effective and efficient manner. But again, what we're highlighting is there's some important ideas and changing or adaptation of thinking or evolution of thinking or raising thinking that the community hopefully reaches in order to embrace those rather than those being imposed on the community. If the community doesn't understand these principles, then running a checklist and accomplishing these things does not make a community, does it?
Mm-mm.
Could I just, because I think this really roots us in onto the nitty gritty of of us doing actual work, which is, by the way, a lot of this stuff I think is not necessarily even starting from a blank sheet of paper. It's more like pulling various threads together into a cohesive whole, which is what your framework there. I've just dropped into the Decoding Law channel. I've dropped there's a project called Decred, which I might have mentioned a few times. I'll definitely bang on about in this project in Edgeware, but they have this. So this link I've just shared into the Decoding Law channel is their constitution, and this for me is the closest thing I've ever come across within crypto that actually is the sort of starting point that you're talking about. Now, I just thought it would be maybe useful if you checked it or had a look at it and just sort of maybe gave your thoughts, because it seems to align with a lot of what you're saying in terms of
what's the? Yeah, I'm just going to try and get it on on Skype. Ramsey, are you able to copy it to me, Ramsey, so I can have a quick squiz? I can give you a quick, if I can see it, I can view it.
Have you sent it, Ramsey?
Yeah.
Or you got
What's the organisation called?
Hang on, I'm sending it to you now, Frank. So you should have it on your Skype.
Okay, great. Thanks. That's what I need. Yeah, cool. All right. So let me scan. Okay, Constitution, principles, blockchain governance, project governance funding. I see they use the word politeia, which is funny. They must have read some Ucadia material to come up with that word. Didn't exist until funny. Okay, so I don't see. Right. Last week I was really clear on what is critical to go through the establishment of the founding document, the document that essentially creates the identity of an entity as its own body, politic and corporate. Richard, if I dialogue with you on this, because you've raised this, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. And in that I said that and there's a process, and you wrote those notes out from that. And in that I said that the most important thing that needs to be is firstly, what is its objects? Like, what is it here to do? Yeah, not principles. Principles are filters. Principles are like virtues. Yeah, they're like the things that you would like to see, the hopes that they're not really getting to nitty gritty. You know, an object is saying, we exist to do this. We exist to do Y. Yeah, it's more nitty gritty. It's more. Well, that's why Companies House requires a company to at least define its objects. What does it exist to do? Yeah, not what does it believe in. Its creed. What does it exist to do? That's the first thing an organisation needs to do, and then after it does that, it needs to define its organs. That is, how is it constructed in terms of authority and power? Yeah, this nexus, this discussion between governance and autonomy. Yeah, between decentralisation of members and the governance structures. I've just scanned this Decred document. It doesn't do that any stretch, shape or form. It says a lot of nice things. It says a lot of high and mighty thoughts. They're using some words that I only seen in Ucadia, politeia, which is good on them for finding that word. But the rest of it, I would say, is closer to the beginning of a prospectus than an actual proper DAO. Do you see that, Richard? Or you don't see that?
I do. I'm just interested in that. Compared to any other project that I've ever been around in crypto, it's almost like they've gone on some of the journey. Like, so you talked about like defining like the membership. So within here, they've defined contractors are a very clear category of an organ, and so it's definitely not as thorough, anywhere near as thorough as you're talking about. But I think compared to the standard that people expect in crypto in general, but certainly in the substrate ecosystem, there is nothing close to this that exists in Kusama, Polkadot, any of the other projects. Like certainly, like Ethereum doesn't have anything like this. Bitcoin obviously would be almost impossible to. So
sure, but here's the danger. This is to me the kind of European Union approach to this. So here's the danger, and I made a caveat too, because I'm not throwing mud. First off, I commend anyone who's done the work to develop something to this level. As you say, you need pioneers. There's a danger of placeholding when you put things like constitution on something and it doesn't even come close to being a constitution. Yeah, that's a danger. The other danger is that you mix policy and bylaws with the key document that essentially affects your existence and cloud those elements. This is what the European documents do. They are bloated with policy statements and bylaws at a level of the charter and structure, which should really be the pithy, essential movement of power. Yeah, because the movement of power, which is the movement of rights and obligations, defines how an organisation works in its layers of systems. That really defines it. And if it's not clear, then in practice, think about what we said. If authority and rights and obligations are not clear in a community, what happens? What happens? We know, but what happens, Richard?
Or trust breaks down.
Exactly, it breaks down. So you can have all the best hopes in the world, and you can use all those hopes as placeholders, but if you don't understand the essence of what you're doing and you don't get that key thing right, which is how does power in the form of rights and obligations work effectively in flowing through that community? If that's not clear, then at some point it's going to break down, isn't it?
Yeah, what you said there, that makes absolute sense to me. That in some ways, like if you start down the path using just reframing or repeating the words you used, like if you go down the path of using these words with principles, with constitution, that in some ways it's a danger, because if you're almost giving people the illusion that there is something solid and
Correct.
and that will almost sort of, when it falls apart, it can kind of fall apart maybe in a bigger way than if it was that if there was more sort of like there was nothing in there in the first place, and it was just more kind of just a sort of like a chaotic kind of like melting pot. It's when people put trust don't have.
Exactly. It would have been the Decred game environment where you sort of are given a number and wish good luck, or a Decred contract. Either of those would be better than this. A Decred contract would be much better, which is defined go back to the rules of a contract. Rules of contract in law are very clear. You know, you lay out the obligations of binding, the elements of what makes a contract effective in law are very clear. They're understood. Every lawyer should know it. It's 101 stuff. And off you go. But once you start stepping in and using these labels and these terms as placeholders, then we're back into one of the dangers that we see across blockchain. And I have to say this, and that is people using words and labels as placeholders and believing that just because they've been the first to do it or they're most audacious to do it, that it's done. It's not done. And certainly in the off-chain world, people see it as, I can't say any other way, as a sandbox. It's actually self-fulfilling, that paradigm of blockchain being a sandbox. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Frank, I see the like Decred as having the intent to want to do something, but perhaps lacking in the necessary competence to build it. And I kind of can draw the analogy to, if you look at how companies form their initial articles of association, you go to a law firm to flesh them out for you. Perhaps, of course you'd have something to say about how deep they actually go, but as opposed to just setting one up yourself, or and even just the template of setting one up oneself is probably a higher standard than in the blockchain sphere. In the blockchain sphere, it seems to be, as we refer to it as a sort of children's playground, where it's almost we're making fun of the older system and everything about it, where even the initial foundational documents have an element of playfulness to it. And so you mentioned there that the founding documents is what identifies what you are, and how to be, so my other question is, the standard model of building these blockchains and setting them free into the kind of decentralized world is setting up a foundation, and that foundation might have like relatively well-defined articles in it, and then setting off the blockchain, and with that blockchain will have defined there the tokenomics with very like fancy font and jazzy stuff, and then the intent there is to have a clear separation between the foundation and the blockchain itself, probably because many people don't know how to deal with these things, even the ones that get paid to establish the trust or the foundation, and so therefore they're quite defensive about making sure that you're kind of separated away from this blockchain experiment. So I mean, so the question is, how can we approach it better? I mean, and I know, like, this is sort of an obtuse question because this is what we've been exploring over the past 4
Okay. Okay. So the answer is to approach it with the same respect that one approaches the core technologies that everyone subscribes to. To approach it with the same respect, because it is all elements of construct to your community. So people who subscribe to and are part of the Polkadot universe, part of the parity in Web3, treat, I hope, seriously the potential of this technology and what it stands for and the approach that's been taken by it. Well, the same seriousness needs to be applied to these other systems. Once you've broken through the mind maze of seeing that it's not a battle between governance and decentralized, that each system will have its own balance between those forces. And to approach it monolithically is to go down the same path of other monolithic problems we have in technology, like, giant monolithic kernels, which is a nightmare. Yeah. So I think attitude has everything to do with it. And I think just to say to people, once you accept that there is a financial system, but it's a separate system that is integrated, it's a different layer, that your membership is a different layer, that your legal is a different layer and your governance is a different layer, and that every layer, every system being a layer, has that balance between its own internal governance and decentralized components, then treat it with the same respect that you treat the technology layer. And if people approach that and approach these skills, I have no doubt that people like Decred and others in the blockchain community are going to step forward from where they are. I'm not here to point fingers at people and go, ha, 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 whatever. I'm not here for that. This is a gift in establishing a relationship based on decades of knowledge, but it's about empowering. It's not about glorifying Ucadia or Franco Collins. It's about empowering. I have no doubt that if people listen to this 5-part series and read the material and approach it with the same respect that they approach the technology, it's going to thrive, no doubt.
Frank,
Ramsey.
Frank,
Yeah.
two connected thoughts to what you just said there.
Yeah.
It seems to me, just if we zoom out on the macro scale of like what's happened since Bitcoin all the way through Ethereum and where we are now, like the journey of blockchain has been in many ways the emergence of these layers through phases. So we kind of started off with just the accounting system. Like where we've ended up with is kind of like the kind of like, well, certainly the latest conversation in Ethereum and certainly with us is membership systems, right, and how those exist. I would add, just as a sort of aside to this, that is the media system another system? Because certainly within...
And thank you for mentioning that is a key one. I missed. Thank you. Yeah. Definitely.
And so I guess this feels like this transitory, or like in many ways people are kind of seeing the edges of what you're talking about, but it's like it's almost like we're in an exciting position right now to go, oh, hang on, we can impart and we can organize and we can structure and explain all of these systems in one go. And obviously we have the ability as a community, because we can upgrade all of these systems through governance, like through the soft and the hard parts of governance. Like we can add new systems as and when they're needed. But it feels like that, because we might be going around a little bit in circles, that the job to be done now is really just the graft of, right, let's define the organs, which obviously was the topic of this talk, because that's really where we've reached. Is like we have
actually, it was more than that, and I appreciate it again. I really do appreciate the inputs. Tonight was actually about raising it above organs. It was about acknowledging that we need to view our DAO, our community, whatever the ones that we belong to, or more broadly, as an aggregation of systems, with each system resolving in its own way its specialization, being defined to a degree by its autonomy, and the balance between those forces of governance and decentralized autonomous systems within it rules. So it wasn't just an organ is a component of that. So it was to evolve beyond last week and talk beyond just that, but also not to default, which is a danger, into saying, right, we've got enough now, let's go, let's get a group together and off we go, bang, 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 and basically run over the top of the community. It's really an imploring to all of you and to everyone that comes and listens to this, that the skills and the ideas that we've been discussing need to find a seed, fertile ground in the community and be part of it. If you find that with the diversity of opinions and people, you will have a thriving and extraordinary community. But if you default to saying, right, there's a checklist of 50 things, stuff it, we're going to do it, and off we go. I've done this so many times. I could show you the checklist. I could give them to you today, but I would really be doing you a disservice if the knowledge I've shared and your own abilities does not find that gelling first. Because the danger is, if you just simply rush off and do it like paint by numbers, yeah, you'll get it all on paper, but in the process, you may have hollowed out the very thing that makes your community thrive, and that is people being passionate and participating and being involved. I think you can do it. There's ways to do it, and we joked about committees before, but there are ways to break things down into groups, to almost kind of create working groups for each system, yeah? Where it's not simply one group coming from the top down and saying, for the whole of this community, we're doing everything. Don't do that. Look at these layers and get people working at each system layer as collaboration. Try and do it in a way that the process is as important as the outcome. Otherwise, you're losing the very thing that gives you that uniqueness. That's what I'd say, Rich. I know it's a long answer, but I just wanted to frame it.
That's absolutely, and I think hopefully one thing that I've tried to say all the way through is that the process is, like, the outcome is fine, but the process is the thing that we're working on. And I would say as well that the thing that's clarified for me in this session, and certainly the last few minutes, has been that when you start seeing these and communicate as different parts of the layers, you start to see where the confrontation and the debate and the kind of tension comes, when someone might be kind of communicating on, we need to move in a certain way as a developer within the technology parts of the system, but that is then in tension with someone who is coming, if it's not defined, from another part of the system, which is operating as a sort of governance or a kind of mediating layer to the technology. Yep. And so that's where we end up with these what can end up being kind of quite fractious arguments, where both sides miss the other side's meaning simply because they're talking from different parts of the organization.
Well, think about what I gave you. So, look, I agree. And I really want to get some more feedback from anyone who wants to talk before we wrap up, because it'll be the wrap up. This is the last one tonight. So for a while, not forever, just for a while. I asked Ramsey to post the notes on the second section of positive law, which speaks to reason and argument. And in that, and I asked you, and you gave us an update that you've sort of got through some of it, started to get through some of it. That document outlines the entirety of historical tools to develop better dialogue, better argument, better debate, and better collaboration in the community. I cannot think of something, arguably more useful and more relevant for the community to really push to develop is better abilities to dialogue and understand the differences, both within the community and external from the community, to develop this flourishing so that people who may have been a bit nervous about discussions or didn't know about Socratic methods, that they become more knowledgeable of them, can use them more, can feel more confident in their discussions with one another. So really, this is the thing. This is where you're at. You have more than enough now to move to the next step. And I would urge, before viewing it purely as and I thank you and I thank everyone who is thinking this way, rather than rushing towards a paint by numbers, take the time to empower the process. Look at working groups, look at the skill sets, look at how this can be an enriching process to reach those milestones. And if you do that, then you're building a mighty community. And any community that listens to this will be building a mighty community.
I've just reshared that document just off the back of that as well.
Cool. Well, does anyone want to comment before we wrap? Because we're getting to 2 hours. I'm really here to answer any questions you have or comments you have, or just your feedback. Did you find this useful? Did people find this useful? No rush.
Yeah, no rush, guys. But yeah, feedback would be great. Even after the call, put your feedback in the Decoding Law.
Fine. Yeah.
Frank's, obviously, you'll be looking at that channel. This is great discussions, and Richard making some great points there.
Yep.
And in terms of the how these organs and how these systems function on a technology level, and I sort of see the technology as sort of the material, the physical part of the body that enables the consciousness or the organism and its spirit to function, if you will. And so on the smallest scale, these working groups, which are already there are already some in Edgeware, in an informal way, are subsets of the community that may perhaps function with multi-sig wallets to manage funds and a informal DAO. Perhaps the next layer would be a relay chain with where each parachain represents each systemic function, be it media, arbitration, financial, balance, currency, what have you. And maybe Frank, if you could summarize there at the end how we can then
definitely look. I think yeah. What I would say is to balance out the practicality, the imperative, the urgency, the logic of all these things that come into play, because there's a multitude of things. There are systems and benefits in rolling this out. I would say that definitely working groups, but even with each working group, there's something to be said about developing a common brief. There's also something to be said about how you establish the feedback loop between working groups and the community so that there is an active nexus, that you do not set people out on boats to go explore and leave that unclear, but that is a recipe for disappointment and potentially fractures. Remember, when you chart people on a course, and I have this from both positive and bitter experience, you better have clear outcomes and clear expectations right from the get-go. Otherwise, you can create a rod for your own back. So I do think before anything is embarked, there needs to be some things bedded down, at least by some consensus, whether it be referenda, just to understand collectively where people go, so they understand that these are not being driven by external influences. Someone's come from outside and suddenly he's doing this and I'm not happy, or there's a bunch of people that kind of are pushing their weight around. You need to answer those things first and foremost by getting, without breaking the spirit of the group, getting some baseline consensus first. Call it the mandate, yeah? Call it the baseline mandate to start the process. And then in small steps, then be clear to the working groups what that mandate gives them, what it doesn't give them. And try and do it in small steps. Don't try and do it all at once, yeah? No one expects this. We spoke again tonight. This is an organic process. Don't expect everyone to try and say today, well, in 2 months we're going to have everything done. That's, trust me, again, talking about scope creep, it's a recipe for frustration and division. Start with minimums. What are the minimum elements that give people confidence and clarity, both in a mix of future foundation and practical outcomes? You've spoken about finance. Even recognising finance as a system is a major step forward. Even recognising systems themselves is a major step forward. So media as a system and that communication is a key one. So I would just say that from this, the present leadership, however it's formed, the present working groups, however it's formed, I would say there are some minimum things that will give confidence to the group that this is not going to kind of go lurching off into some unknown direction. And I think there needs to be a minimum mandate, definitely amongst groups where there is that dynamic. Otherwise, you're not holding true to that decentralized principle. I think you do need to have that as part of your planning, and don't overload it. Don't overload the chain, don't overload the referenda, but at least get that minimum. And if people don't participate, that's their choice at the end of the day. And some people are happy not to, but always keep in mind to give people that opportunity. So, Ramsey, I can help at these stages wherever you want me to help. I have a commitment, obviously, with Ucadia and the funding of Ucadia and the rollout of that, which is my key priority at the moment. But equally, as I've made the commitment to you, I see future of connections between these communities as Ucadia communities, as the synthesis of these ideas. So, I'm here to help however you wish me to help. But I think this series, we've reached the point now that we round this off, and then the next stages focus on the nuts and bolts of how to step forward through this and achieve these things.
Indeed, Frank, yes. And of course, we'd like to thank you for being so gracious and imparting your mentorship and wisdom to this community, to Edgeware community, and almost using us as the bridge into blockchain and to create that kind of platform for us to develop our competences in building the required and necessary minimum viable systems and to enable these minimum viable societies, as we mentioned on various titles of these series. And so, yeah, we're very grateful. Thank you. And the it's worth more than a very high paid consultant, of course. And you're doing it out of developing ongoing cooperation. And so thank you for that again. And hopefully we can pick up this short break will give people a chance to reflect on the materials and develop their understanding and and generate some feedback. This series of course going on online on YouTube. So
I really appreciate it. Look, I wrap up with this final thought. Three things come to mind just briefly in a wrap up from me. The first is, if you listen back to this series, I do believe in absolute truth that you will hear and read and see the minimum viable tools necessary to develop a sovereign autonomous organisation. That I do believe we reach that. So I think with the 5 parts fulfill that promise. The second is I appreciate thank you, and I thank the feedback. I really appreciate this. And this is, to me, just the start of a relationship. And the last thing I say is, you're talking about very talented communities, and you are all very talented people. And I do truly believe that you are part of charting a course that the world needs, and certainly the blockchain community needs. And I look forward to working with you in the future. So with that, thank you guys. I'm off. And until we start the next part of this journey, thank you very much. See you later. Bye.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a great one.
Bye.